When a card costs 2 mana of the same color, it tends to be pretty powerful for the mana value. This is because, in order to consistently have those 2 mana of the same color, especially on turn 2, you need to have a substantial commitment to lands that produce that color of mana. Additionally, these kinds of cards tend to have some extra color appropriate effects. For example, when you pay 2 red, you often get a nice aggressive creature or a powerful burn spell. And in this video, we'll be taking a look at the best things you can get for that mana investment. In all, there are 47 cards that cost exactly 2 red mana, and in this video, we'll be looking at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. So you might be wondering why I'm not looking at cards that cost 3 red mana, as I've recently done top 10s on cards that cost 3 green and 3 black, and the answer is there aren't enough cards that cost 3 red mana that have seen competitive play, and the same is true for white and blue too. Anyway, before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Stigma Lasher. For 2 red mana, and that's the last time I'll say that in this video, otherwise it would get repetitive, it's a 2/2 with Wither, which means it does combat damage in the form of -1/-1 counters, and it also has a fairly unique effect. Whenever it deals damage to a player, that player can't gain life for the rest of the game. This is a super red card, since red often hates on life gain because it's frequently the bane of a red mage's existence. After all, if you're playing a deck that can cast this consistently on turn 2, you're probably a mono-red aggro deck looking to do tons of damage in a hurry, and life gain can derail the game plan in a big way. People made a pretty big deal about the Duskmourn card Screaming Nemesis, which also shuts down life gain for the rest of the game, but Stigma Lasher actually did it first, way back in 2008. Anyway, it's also nice the Lasher comes with Wither. The big benefit of doing combat damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters is that even when this chump blocks or gets blocked by a bigger creature, it permanently downgrades the creature it went into combat with. Stigma Lasher gained all of its points in 2008. When it appeared in Block, Standard, and Extended, red deck wins. At number 9, it's Final Fortune. It's really the only card on the list that doesn't do something that feels extremely red. At least it may not immediately seem like a red effect. After all, it's a time walk. In other words, it gives you an extra turn, but it comes with a substantial downside. You lose the game at the end of that turn. That last part reflects red's somewhat reckless nature, but it also synergizes pretty well with what lots of red decks want to do. Frequently, even when you lose with your red deck, there's a good chance that if you just had one more turn to keep your opponent from stabilizing, you would have won. And that's exactly what Final Fortune can give you. With that in mind, it shouldn't come as a surprise that this is yet another card on the list to be featured in mono red decks. It was even part of the Sly decks that really represented the moment when modern red deck wins as we know it was born. However, it hasn't gained any points since 2005. At number 8, it's Slith Firewalker, another aggressive 2-drop. This one is a 1/1 with haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Slith. That ability pairs nicely with haste, since it allows it to come out of nowhere and hit the opponent and get that first counter, and things can really snowball from there. The Firewalker might be pretty inefficient at first, but getting in once makes it a formidable creature, and if you can keep cracking in with it, it quickly becomes a major problem. This is another red 2-drop that gained all of its points in red aggro decks, in this case in Block, Standard, and Extended, and all those points came between 2004 and 2005. At number 7, it's Scorching Shot, the newest card on the list by a wide margin. It's a sorcery that does 5 damage to target creature. 2 mana for 5 damage that doesn't require any setup at all is a great rate, something that we've really only seen on one other card, Roast, which couldn't damage flyers. It also gives red an efficient way to kill what is arguably the best creature in both Standard and Pioneer, Sheoldred the Apocalypse. That's why Scorching Shot has quickly seen plenty of play in both Standard and Pioneer. And in the latter, it hasn't only been featured in aggro decks. Indomitable Creativity combo decks are using it too, since they tend to have lots of red mana, and this is a super efficient removal spell. It just came out this year, and it's already at number 7, and it's only going to move up the list in the future, and has a pretty good shot at being in the top 4 someday. At number 6, it's Ash Zealot. It's a 2/2 with First Strike and Haste, and whenever a player casts a spell from a graveyard, Ash Zealot does 3 damage to that player. Haste and First Strike are very red keyword abilities, and damaging players when they perform certain actions is also right up Red's alley. The Punisher effect here is symmetrical, but as is the case with most symmetrical burn, if you're the beatdown, you don't really care if you're getting damaged too, although in this case, most of the decks that played the Zealot didn't play many cards that would damage them anyway. It was played in Rakdos, Mono Red, and Devotion to Red decks while it was in Standard. It was legal at a time where Lingering Souls and Think Twice were pretty powerful spells, and the Ash Zealot made it pretty difficult for your opponent to activate those, provided you had a good aggressive start. It also saw a little bit of play in the early days of Pioneer because it was great against Underworld Breach, which lets you cast a bunch of spells from your graveyard. Since Breach has been banned though, it hasn't been played in Pioneer, and it hasn't put up a top 8 anywhere since 2020. At number 5, it's Blood Knight. It's a 2-2 with First Strike and protection from white. White is one of Red's enemy colors, so giving a super red card protection from that color makes a lot of sense. Unsurprisingly, it was played in mono red aggro decks in both block and standard, and it was always a main deck card since it was pretty good even when you didn't play against white opponents, and many opponents were playing white in those formats anyway. More recently, it saw some significant play in legacy sideboards. This is because for a while there, mono-white initiative decks took over the format, with White Plume Adventurer powering lots of decks. When you have the initiative, you can generate insane value by venturing into the Undercity every turn, but initiative does come with one downside. If you get damaged, your opponent takes it from you, and they get to start venturing into the dungeon. So Blood Knight was perfect against these decks because they generally couldn't interact with it in any way, and that includes blocking, so taking the initiative from your opponent was pretty easy. However, the Adventurer eventually got banned out of the format, putting an end to Blood Knight's foray into Legacy. It's pretty interesting that both Ash Zealot and Blood Knight saw a resurgence in non-rotating formats because they were good against dominant strategy in those formats, but in both cases that strategy ultimately got banned, meaning the end of top 8s for both of them. At number 4, it's Conspicuous Snoop. It's a 2-2 that lets you play with the top card of your library revealed. It also lets you cast goblin spells from the top of your library, and if that top card is a goblin, the Snoop has all of that card's activated abilities. So the Snoop is not only a serious value engine in a goblin deck, since it can let you rip goblin after goblin off the top of your deck, it also has some serious combo potential, as it gives you more access to powerful activated abilities. There weren't enough goblins while it was in Standard for it to see any play there, but it's done some serious work in all the other 60-card formats where there are goblin decks. In Pioneer, the Snoop isn't really used for combo purposes, but just casting goblins off the top and sometimes being able to use Battlecry Goblin's ability even when it isn't in play is pretty sweet. In other formats, though, it provides the same value potential while also enabling some instant win combos. Boggart Harbinger gives Modern Legacy and Vintage Goblin decks the ability to put whatever goblin you want on top of your deck, opening up all kinds of possibilities. Putting Kiki Jiki on the top is the most effective, as you can simply use Kiki's activated ability to copy the Snoop and repeat that as many times as you want, since each new copy of the Snoop will have Kiki Jiki's ability. And then once you have enough copies, you can use the last one to copy Boggart Harbinger and put Sling Gang Lieutenant or Mog Fanatic on top, and then sacrifice all of your goblins to kill your opponent. While it would be a stretch to call goblins one of the best decks in any of those formats, it is a deck that is often a factor in all of those formats, and that's allowed the Scoop to amass a significant number of top 8s ever since being printed. It's likely to continue to add to that score too, but not at an especially quick pace, and the top 3 cards on this list are in a league of their own when compared to the cards we've seen so far. After all 3 of them have more than 100 points. At number 3, it's Searing Blood. It's a little surprising that so far we haven't seen a burn spell on this list, at least if we're defining burn as a spell that can damage the opponent, but we have one here. It's an instant that does 2 damage to a creature, and when that creature dies that turn, it does 3 damage to that creature's controller. So this lets you take out a small creature and do 3 to your opponent. That's pretty good if you're a red aggro deck, as removing a blocker and bolting your opponent in the face can very easily give you lethal. It should come as no surprise then that red aggro and burn decks throughout multiple 60-card formats have used Searing Blood over the years, allowing to amass more than 100 points. It's still pretty active today in Pioneer and Modern, and it's likely to continue to add to its score. At number 2, it's another Searing Burn spell, Searing Blaze. It's older than Searing Blood and definitely inspired that design because the 2 cards are pretty similar. Both of them damage a creature and a player. Searing Blaze is an instant that does 1 damage to target player and 1 damage to target creature that player controls, and if you add a land into the battlefield this turn, it does 3 damage to both targets instead. So if you have played a land, it's better than Searing Blood by a pretty wide margin. 1 more damage to a creature might not sound like a huge difference, but being able to take down 3 toughness creatures is a big upgrade. That said, Searing Blaze is much worse if you haven't played a land. Luckily for Searing Blaze, most of the formats it's been a part of have featured fetch lands like Arid Mesa, which make it far easier for you to make sure you trigger landfall every single turn. The ubiquity of fetch lands has led to Searing Blaze actually seeing more play in Modern than Searing Blood does. Searing Blaze is also a common, meaning Pauper players have access to it. That's a format where only commons are legal. Searing Blaze is likely to continue to gain points in both Pauper and Modern, and I think it'll manage to stay ahead of Searing Blood in the future. And at number 1, it's Eidolon of the Great Revel. This enchantment creature is a 2/2, and anytime a player casts a spell with mana value 3 or less, it does 2 damage to that player. While that effect does hurt both players, the decks that run the Eidolon are hyper-aggressive decks like Burn and Red Deck Wins. They don't really care about losing life because their whole plan is to win the game before their opponent can ever stabilize in the first place, and the Eidolon does make it pretty hard for that to happen. Because cheap spells are commonplace in most competitive Magic decks, it tends to chip in a whole bunch of damage for a very low mana investment, and that's exactly what red burn decks want. In all the formats it's ever been played in, which include Standard, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy, it's been played in mono-red aggro decks or Red Deck Wins. It's going to continue to thrive too, especially in Pioneer and Modern, so it's likely to hang on to the number 1 spot on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the best Magic cards that cost 2 red mana. Are you interested in doing a bunch of damage to your opponent with any of these powerful red cards? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, including more MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at specific mana values, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.